1940. New Zealand was alone in the South Pacific, with no army, no weapons, no tanks. Japan was advancing relentlessly. Invasion seemed a matter of weeks. Then a farmer politician named Bob Semple had an absolutely crazy idea: to weld corrugated metal sheets onto farm tractors and turn them into tanks. Military engineers laughed, the press mocked, but Bob built them anyway. The result was considered the worst tank ever created in history. But there was method in the madness. Stay until the end to find out why this ridiculous tank may have saved a nation from utter despair. Robert Semple was born in 1873 in Taranaki, New Zealand, the son of Irish immigrants who worked on a dairy farm. From childhood, Bob was known for two things: impressive physical strength and a natural aptitude with machines. By the age of 15, he was already repairing complex agricultural equipment that baffled even experienced mechanics. But Bob was more than just a talented mechanic. He had a keen social conscience and a gift for organizing people. In the 1890s, when New Zealand farm workers were being exploited by wealthy landowners, Bob began organizing unions. It was dangerous work. Landowners often hired thugs to discourage union organizers. Bob was not intimidated. At 6'3", tall, and with the strength of a bull, he could defend himself physically if necessary. But his true weapon was eloquence. He spoke the language of ordinary workers because he was one of them. He understood their struggles because he had lived them. In 1908, at the age of 35, Bob was elected to the New Zealand Parliament representing the Labour Party. It was a remarkable rise for a man without formal education, who had begun his life as a farm labourer. For the next 3 decades, Bob would be an influential figure in New Zealand politics. In 1935, when the Labour Party finally came to power after years in opposition, Bob Semple was appointed Minister of Public Works. It was a perfect position for a man of his experience, responsible for infrastructure, construction, and industrial development. Bob oversaw massive projects: highways, bridges, hydroelectric dams. But there was a growing problem that kept Bob awake at night: national defense. New Zealand in the 1930s was an extremely vulnerable nation. Its population was only 1.6 million. People scattered across 2 isolated islands in the South Pacific. The army was small and poorly equipped. The Air Force was practically non-existent. The Navy consisted of a few outdated ships. During World War I, New Zealand sent 100,000 men to fight in Europe, the highest per capita mobilization rate of any Allied nation. But modern military equipment, virtually zero. Bob understood brutal geography. New Zealand was 2,000 kilometers from Australia, 10,000 kilometers from Great Britain. If an invasion came, they would be alone for months before help could arrive. And in 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and World War II began, Bob's fears intensified. Although the war was initially focused on Europe, Bob saw disturbing patterns. Japan had already invaded China in 1937. The Japanese Empire was expansionist, militaristic, and increasingly aggressive. In 1940, the situation worsened dramatically. France fell in June. Great Britain was alone against Nazi Germany. And in the Pacific, Japan began to look south, to resources in Indonesia, Malaysia, and potentially Australia and New Zealand. Bob Semple, now 67, faced a seemingly impossible dilemma. As Minister of Public Works, he was responsible for industrial production during wartime. But New Zealand had no arms industry. It had no factories for tanks, airplanes, or heavy artillery. Military equipment had to be imported from Great Britain, which was desperately producing for its own survival. New Zealand orders were constantly delayed, cancelled, or simply ignored. Bob needed a solution, one that was quick, cheap, and feasible, using locally available resources. That's when he had the idea that would make his name live on in history, though not in the way he expected. If they couldn't import tanks, they would build their own. And they would do so using what New Zealand had in abundance: agricultural tractors and farmers' determination. To understand why Bob Semple did what he did, we need to understand the atmosphere of absolute panic that gripped New Zealand in 1940 and 1941. The Japanese were not a distant theoretical enemy. They were a real and imminent threat. In September 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina. In July 1941, they occupied the rest of Indochina. Each move was a step closer to the South Pacific. British and American intelligence services warned that a Japanese attack was a matter of when, not if, and New Zealand was painfully unprepared. The New Zealand Army, called the Second New Zealand Expeditionary Force, was fighting in North Africa and Greece. They were excellent soldiers, but they were 20,000 kilometers from home. If Japan invaded, they would not be able to defend their homeland. Home defense consisted of territorial force, reserve, home guard, civilian volunteers, and a handful of regular troops. Equipment was shameful. Many volunteers trained with painted brooms to simulate rifles because there weren't enough real weapons. Heavy artillery, virtually non-existent. Tanks, zero, literally zero tanks in the entire New Zealand territory. The civilian population was terrified. Newspapers published maps showing how easily Japan could reach New Zealand. Families in coastal towns built makeshift shelters. Evacuation plans were drawn up. Children practiced air raid drills at school. The government ordered nightly blackouts. Windows were covered, streetlights were turned off, and cars drove without headlights. The fear was that Japanese bombers might use city lights as navigation guides. Bob Semple received daily letters from desperate citizens asking what the government was doing to protect them. He had no comforting answers. The defense budget was stretched to its limit. New Zealand was a small and relatively poor nation. Producing modern weaponry from scratch was financially impossible, and time was running out. It was in this context of despair that Bob had his epiphany. He was visiting a farm in Canterbury, watching Caterpillar D8 tractors at work, when the idea struck him. Tractors had mobility. They had powerful engines. They had tracks that could traverse difficult terrain. Why not convert them into armored vehicles? Critics would say it was a ridiculous idea. Tractors were slow, unprotected, never designed for combat. But Bob saw things differently. He saw available resources that could be transformed into something, anything better than nothing. He presented the idea to the War Cabinet. The reaction was mixed. Some ministers thought it pragmatic, others thought it was embarrassing. New Zealand would be an international laughingstock if it tried to fight Japanese tanks with armored tractors. But Bob had a powerful argument. What is the alternative? To wait passively while the Japanese land on our shores, or to fight with what we have? There was no real counter-argument. Permission was granted. Bob had the green light for his experiment. He assembled a team of engineers, welders, and mechanics, many of whom were public works workers he had employed on infrastructure projects. They were all practical men who knew how to work with metal, machinery, and improvisation. The chosen location was the railway workshops in Wellington, the capital of New Zealand. There was industrial equipment there, lathes, drills, welding equipment, and a skilled workforce. The project was classified as urgent and given priority. Workers operated in 24-hour shifts. The goal was to create a functional prototype in weeks, not months. Bob Semple, a 67-year-old minister, frequently appeared in person at the workshops, offering suggestions, encouraging workers, and occasionally picking up a welding torch himself to demonstrate technique. Bob Semple tank was about to be born, and the world would soon laugh at it. The Bob Semple tank was based on a Caterpillar D8 tractor, a robust agricultural machine used for heavy-duty work on farms and in construction. With a 110 horsepower diesel engine and a reliable track system, the D8 was a workhorse of the New Zealand industry. But transforming an agricultural tractor into a combat vehicle required considerable imagination and a lot of welding. Bob's design was surprisingly ambitious. He didn't just want to armor an existing tractor. He wanted to create a functional combat vehicle with multiple weapon positions. The superstructure was built using corrugated metal sheets, a common material used in rural roofs and sheds in New Zealand. It wasn't high-grade military armored steel. It was literally roofing material, but it was what was available. Corrugated. Sheets were cut, bent and welded to create an angled box around the tractor. The design was peculiar. It looked more like improvised rural construction than a military vehicle, but there was logic to the approach. The corrugated metal, though thin, offered more structural strength than flat sheet metal of the same thickness due to the corrugations. Bob and his engineers hoped it could deflect or absorb impacts from rifle bullets, if not heavy machine guns. The crew compartment was designed for 8 men, an extraordinarily high number for an armored vehicle. The layout was driver in, the front, commander above, and 6 gunners in positions around the superstructure. The armament consisted of 6 .303 caliber Bren machine guns, standard British weapons that New Zealand had in limited stock. Each gunner operated a Bren through a gap in the armor. The idea was that the tank could unleash a significant volume of fire in multiple directions simultaneously. There were also provisions for anti-aircraft machine guns mounted on top in case Japanese planes attacked, but the design had obvious problems that became apparent immediately during construction. First, weight. Adding a metal frame and 8 crew members to the D8 tractor drastically increased the weight. The 110 horsepower engine, suitable for agricultural work, was overloaded. Top speed dropped to approximately 15 kilometers per hour on flat terrain. On uneven terrain, it was even slower. Second, height. To accommodate 8 men and multiple weapon positions, the superstructure was high, over 3.5 meters. This made the tank a huge target and easily visible. Any principles of camouflage or low profile were completely ignored. Third, visibility. The driver had only narrow slits to see through the armor. Driving was extremely difficult, especially on rough terrain or during combat, when visibility would be even more restricted by smoke and confusion. Fourth, protection. Improvised ballistic tests revealed that corrugated metal could stop rifle bullets at long distances, but was vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire and completely ineffective against any artillery or anti-tank gun. Fifth, ergonomics. The interior was cramped, uncomfortable, and extremely hot. In the New Zealand summer, the internal temperature could exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Ventilation was inadequate. The crew would be exhausted quickly, but Bob persisted. The first prototype was completed in December 1940. When it rolled out of the workshop, the reaction was mixed. Some workers applauded. They had built something from scratch in weeks. Military officers present were more skeptical. One colonel reportedly commented, "Well, it certainly looks impressive." In a way, the press was invited to a public demonstration. Journalists watched as the Bob Semple tank crossed the railroad yard, its 8 crew members firing Brens at training targets. The next day's headlines were mixed. Some newspapers applauded the Kiwi ingenuity. Others were less kind. Semple's tin tank was a particularly scathing headline, but Bob didn't care about the critics. He ordered the production of additional units. The goal was to build dozens of these tanks to equip territorial defense units. The Bob Semple tank was officially in production, and it was about to become legendary for all the wrong reasons. While Bob Semple oversaw the production of his tanks, the international military community began to take notice, and the reaction was brutal. British military attachés in Wellington sent reports to London describing the project. The reply was polite but firm, innovative but unsuitable for modern combat. Translation, it was a joke. American military analysts were more direct. A 1941 intelligence report called The Bob Semple Tank, an improvised agricultural construction with no real military value. But the most scathing criticism came from New Zealand tank veterans serving in North Africa. They fought in real British tanks, Matildas, Crusaders, Valentines, against the German Afrika Korps. When they heard about Bob's project, their reaction was disbelief, followed by anger. "We're dying here in real tanks fighting German panzers," a tank commander wrote in a letter that eventually leaked to the press. "And back home they're wasting resources on tractors with sheet metal roofs." It's an insult. Technical criticisms were numerous and devastating. Inadequate armor, corrugated metal 12-13 mm thick, offered virtually no protection beyond long-range rifle fire. Japanese heavy machine guns would easily pierce it. Anti-tank guns would tear it to pieces. Pathetic speed, a maximum speed of 15 km/h, meant it would be overtaken by motorized infantry. It could not maneuver quickly to avoid threats or exploit tactical opportunities. Huge profile. At 3.65 meters tall, it was an impossible target to miss. A basic principle of tank design is to maintain a low profile. Bob Semple was the opposite of that. Overcrowding 8 men in a cramped space was a logistical nightmare. Coordinating fire from 6 machine guns simultaneously would be chaotic. Emergency evacuation would be slow and dangerous. Lack of radio. Communication between tanks was through hand signals or messengers. Coordinating multiple vehicles in combat would have been virtually impossible. Weak armament. Bren machine guns were excellent infantry weapons, but inadequate for vehicle combat. They could not penetrate enemy armor. They were only effective against unprotected infantry. Complex maintenance. Although based on a reliable tractor, the addition of heavy superstructure and military equipment created multiple points of failure. Field maintenance would be difficult. Terrible mobility. Although the D8 tracks were robust, the added weight and high center of gravity made the vehicle unstable. Traversing rough terrain or leaning on hills was dangerous. The risk of tipping over was real. Comparisons with contemporary tanks were humiliating. American Sherman, 48 km/h, 75 mm cannon, 76 mm armor, 5 crew members. German Panzer IV, 42 km/h, 75 mm cannon, 80 mm armor, 5 crew members. Bob Semple, 15 km/h, 6.303 caliber machine guns, 12 mm armor, 8 crew members. There was no competition. In any engagement with a real tank, Bob Semple would be destroyed in seconds. Cruel nicknames proliferated. Semple's mobile shed, cardboard tank, corrugated iron disgrace. A New Zealand satirical magazine published a cartoon showing Bob Semple tank being destroyed by an angry cow. Caption: "Finally meets a worthy opponent," but there was one detail that critics completely missed. Bob Semple never expected these tanks to engage German panzers or even Japanese medium tanks. He had a completely different purpose in mind, and for that specific purpose, however ridiculous it might seem, Bob Semple tank made perfect sense. Bob Semple wasn't an idiot. He understood perfectly well that his tanks were inferior to real military weaponry. But critics didn't understand New Zealand's unique strategic context. The New Zealand Defence Plan in 1940-41 was not to fight tank battles against the invading Japanese army. It was impossible. Japan had hundreds of actual tanks, experienced crews, and massive air support. The defense strategy was different, to make the invasion so costly that the Japanese would choose easier targets. Bob envisioned a specific scenario: Japanese forces attempting an amphibious landing on New Zealand beaches. This was the most vulnerable and likely point of attack. In this scenario, Bob Semple tanks would have a specific role: mobile fortifications to defend beach positions. Think of it this way: Japanese infantry disembarking from invasion barges would face heavy machine gun fire. 6 Brens firing simultaneously could unleash approximately 3,000 rounds per minute. Against infantry in open terrain, that would be devastating. Corrugated metal, though inadequate against cannons, could protect crews from rifle and light machine gun fire that assault infantry would initially carry. Enemy tanks would come later, but initial waves would leave infantry vulnerable. Slow speed didn't matter because tanks would be in prepared defensive positions, not chasing enemies or performing offensive maneuvers. They would essentially be bunkers that could slowly reposition themselves if necessary. A tall profile was indeed a problem, but Bob planned to use terrain and camouflage to mitigate it. Positioned behind sand dunes or in natural depressions, height would be less critical. 8 crew members allowed for rotation during prolonged combat. The team could rest, replenish ammunition, or treat minor injuries while others maintained fire. In a battle of attrition defending a beach, this was valuable. Most importantly, the psychological effect. Even a bad tank is intimidating to infantry without adequate anti-tank support. The sound of the engine, the appearance of the armored vehicle, machine guns firing, all of this would impact the morale of attackers. And there was a brutal economic factor. Cost. An American Sherman tank cost approximately $50,000 in 1942, equivalent to $850,000 today. A Bob Semple tank cost approximately 800 New Zealand pounds, about 3,200 USD, or $55,000 USD adjusted for inflation today. For the cost of 1 Sherman, New Zealand could build 15-16 Bob Semple tanks and build them locally using domestic resources without relying on imports that could be intercepted by submarines. Production time also favored Bob. Sherman took months to build in an American factory, then weeks to transport to the South Pacific. Bob Semple could be built in 2 to 3 weeks in Wellington. In total war, when resources are limited and time is critical, a good enough available now often trumps perfect that arrives too late. Bob also planned mass production. The goal was 200-plus tanks to equip multiple territorial defense units along both islands. Any invading force would face defense in depth, even if each individual position was weak. The concept wasn't original. Soviets used inadequate T-26 light tanks in massive numbers during the initial German invasion precisely because they were available. When better tanks weren't, Finns converted civilian vehicles into improvised armored vehicles. During the Winter War with the Soviet Union, Bob Semple was applying the same principle. Use what you have, because something is better than nothing. But there was a fatal flaw in the whole strategy. It depended entirely on the Japanese invasion actually happening. And what if it didn't? The Bob Semple tank would be judged not by its practical usefulness, but by how ridiculous it looked compared to real tanks. And history would not be kind. Between December 1940 and mid-1942, approximately 3-4 Bob Semple tanks were fully built, with several other units in different stages of production. The exact number is debated by historians because production records were incomplete. What is not discussed, production was slow, problematic, and eventually cancelled. Problems arose immediately. Caterpillar D8 tractors were precious assets needed for critical infrastructure, airfield construction, defensive fortifications, military roads. Converting D8s into tanks meant removing them from these essential functions. A conflict arose between the Department for Public Works, Bob Semple, and the Department for Defense. The Defense Department argued that D8s were better suited as construction equipment to fortify defensive positions than as improvised tanks of questionable value. Bob fought to keep the project alive, but political pressures were mounting. Other ministers began publicly questioning the allocation of resources. In Parliament, opposition members attacked Bob Semple tank as a white elephant and a waste of public money. The press became increasingly critical. An editorial in the Wellington Evening Post in March 1941 argued, While our lads in North Africa fight with real equipment, we waste resources on mechanical fantasies. But there was a more significant development. The strategic situation was changing. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Suddenly, pressure on Great Britain eased slightly. The British began sending more equipment to the Commonwealth, including New Zealand. In December 1941, everything changed. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war, and crucially, Americans began building a massive military presence in the Pacific. For New Zealand, this meant they were no longer isolated and vulnerable. The American Navy patrolled the oceans. American aviation established bases, and eventually, American military equipment, including actual tanks, would begin to flow in. The desperate need that had motivated Bob Semple tank was evaporating. The project was quietly cancelled in mid-1942. What happened to the tanks that were built? Records are vague, but apparently Unit 1, prototype, used for field training near Wellington. Crews practiced beach defense tactics. Eventually decommissioned and likely scrapped. Units 2 to 3, designated for territorial defense units, but rarely operated. Maintenance was problematic, and there was no real threat to justify their use. Incomplete units, disassembled, and components recycled. D8 tractors returned to civil construction service. No Bob Semple tank ever fired a shot in anger. None saw combat. None survived to this day as a museum artifact. For many, this confirmed that they had been a complete waste from the start. But some Home Guard veterans saw it differently. Sergeant Thomas Wilson, who trained with Bob Semple tank in 1941, recalled in a 1985 interview, "Everyone laughed at him, of course. But having something, even something ridiculous, was better than having nothing. It gave us a sense that we could fight, that we weren't completely defenseless. That mattered for morale." Another veteran, Corporal James Mackenzie, "We knew it wasn't a real tank, but it was concrete. It was tangible. It was evidence that someone was trying to protect us. In 1941, when invasion seemed imminent, that meant something." There was also a more practical perspective from Commander John Harrison. "Training on Bob Semple taught us crew coordination, communication under stress, teamwork in confined spaces. When we eventually received real tanks, that training was not wasted. But in the broader context, Bob Semple tank became a joke. And Bob Semple himself became a target of ridicule. Bob Semple didn't let the tank project define the rest of his career, but the shadow lingered. Every time he spoke in Parliament about defence issues, opposition members inevitably made jokes about Semple's farm tanks. But Bob was a seasoned politician. He absorbed criticism and kept working. As Minister of Public Works during the war, he oversaw massive infrastructure projects that actually contributed significantly to the war effort. Airfields built under Bob's supervision enabled Allied air operations in the South Pacific. Military roads facilitated the rapid movement of troops. Port facilities allowed for the landing of American equipment. These contributions were significant and real. But they weren't dramatic or visually memorable like bizarre tanks. The media focused on spectacular failures, not mundane successes. In 1943, Bob Semple resigned as Minister of Public Works due to health problems. He was 70 years old, and decades of hard work were taking their toll. He remained in Parliament until 1944, after which he retired from politics completely. Bob's final years were peaceful. He lived in Wellington, occasionally giving interviews about his political years. When asked about tanks, he was defensive but without regrets. "We did what we thought was necessary with the resources we had," he consistently said. Critics have the luxury of hindsight. "We only had the urgency of the moment." In 1952, an interviewer asked if he considered the tank a mistake. Bob replied, "A mistake is not trying anything. We tried, it didn't work as we expected. But in 1940, doing nothing would have been criminal," he added with a wry smile, "and at least it gave welders work during difficult times. It's not completely useless." Bob Semple died on September 20, 1955. At the age of 82, obituaries focused on his long career in the labor movement, contributions to workers' rights, and infrastructure projects. Tank was mentioned briefly, usually with a tone of historical curiosity. Some obituaries were kind, others less so. But none captured the full context of why he did what he did. Decades passed. Bob Semple Tank disappeared from the New Zealand public consciousness. He occasionally appeared in military history books as a footnote about bizarre war improvisations. But then, in the internet age, something extraordinary happened. In the 2000s, Bob Semple Tank was rediscovered by online communities fascinated by obscure military technology. Military history forums and eventually internet memes turned the tank into a cult celebrity. The Bob Semple Tank has become an ironic symbol of making the best of what you have. Military strategy games have started, including it as an Easter egg. YouTubers have created videos analyzing its design with affectionate humor. A Reddit user summed up the sentiment perfectly. Bob Semple Tank is the spirit of every person who has ever tried to fix something with duct tape and hope. It's gloriously terrible and terribly glorious. New Zealand embraced the absurd. A scale model of the Bob Semple Tank was displayed at the Auckland War Memorial Museum, not as an example of military brilliance, but as a testament to Kiwi determination and ingenuity in the face of adversity. New Zealand documentaries about World War II now include a segment about tanks, usually with a tone of affected pride. Yes, we built the worst tank in the world, but we built something when we had nothing. Bob Semple, the man, has also been re-evaluated. Modern historians point out that he was pragmatic, doing the best he could with an impossible situation. In 1940, with Japan advancing and no external aid available, doing nothing was not an option. Professor Richard Anderson, a military historian at Victoria University in Wellington, argues the Bob Semple Tank should be judged not by military engineering standards, but by the context of desperation in which it was created. In that context, it wasn't entirely irrational. There is also the argument that the project had psychological and political value that transcended military effectiveness. It demonstrated that the government was acting, that New Zealand was not a passive victim, that Kiwis would fight with whatever they had, and there was historical precedent for such thinking. During the London Blitz, the British built fake wooden anti-aircraft guns to give the appearance of a stronger defense than they actually had. The goal was not to shoot down German planes, but to boost civilian morale and potentially confuse enemy aerial reconnaissance. Bob Semple Tank operated on the same logic, a symbol of resistance, even if its substance was questionable. The Bob Semple Tank was not the only example of a desperate, improvised tank during World War II. When we examine the broader context, we see that multiple nations facing similar emergencies made similarly unorthodox choices. Soviet Union, NI-1, Nai Ispug, for the fright. During the initial panic of the German invasion in 1941, the Soviets converted STZ-5 agricultural tractors into makeshift tanks. Called NI-1, they were strikingly similar to the Bob Semple. Thin sheet metal armor, machine gun armament, slow speed, crucial difference. NI-1s saw real combat. During the siege of Odessa and the defense of Stalingrad, these improvised tanks were used in desperate attacks against German positions. They were decimated by German artillery, but they played a role in critical moments when real tanks were unavailable. The Soviets built approximately 100 NI-1s. None survived the war. But unlike Bob Semple, they proved a concept. A bad tank was better than no tank when the alternative was total defeat. Finland, OT-130 and OT-131 during the winter. War against the Soviet Union, 1939-40. Finns converted agricultural tractors into armored vehicles. They used any available armor. Even bank vault doors were welded on as frontal protection. The Finns called these vehicles ersatz tanks, replacement tanks. They were as bad as Bob Semple, but the Finns had no choice. With an army of 300,000 facing a Soviet force of 1 million, every resource had to be used. These ersatz tanks were used primarily for morale support and armored transport duties. But they symbolized Finnish determination to fight against impossible odds, and that determination eventually forced the Soviets to negotiate peace. Australia, LP1. Frog, New Zealand's closest ally, also built an improvised tank. In 1942, when a Japanese invasion of Australia seemed imminent, an Australian designer built the LP1, also known as Frog. Based on a tractor chassis with homemade armour and machine gun armament, it was essentially the Australian version of the Bob Semple. Only one prototype was built. Tests showed it was unsuitable for combat, and the project was cancelled. But the existence of LP1 proves that Bob Semple was not alone in his thinking. Facing the same Japanese threat with the same limited resources, the Australians arrived at the same solution. France, chenilette d'infanterie, even before the war. France experimented with makeshift tankettes using tractor chassis. The project was abandoned in favor of proper tanks, but the concept showed that professional military personnel also considered converting civilian vehicles when resources were limited. Great Britain, Bison Concrete. Armoured lorry. The British built armoured vehicles using trucks covered in concrete. They weren't tanks, but the concept was similar, armouring civilian vehicles to create military capability when production of dedicated vehicles was insufficient. These were primarily used for airfield security. But the principle was identical to Bob Semple's thinking, the common pattern. All of these projects shared some characteristics. Created during emergencies when adequate equipment was not available, they used chassis from civilian vehicles, usually tractors or trucks, improvised body armor, made from locally available materials, weaponry, limited to machine guns, criticized by military experts as inadequate, defended by creators as better than nothing. Bob Semple tank was not a unique aberration. He was an example of the universal human response to an emergency, doing something, anything, with the resources available. The difference was that Bob Semple became famous. Other improvised tanks were forgotten because the nations that built them had bigger war stories to tell. New Zealand, being relatively safe after 1942, had the luxury of reflecting on its defense preparations, including its peculiar tank. And so, Bob Semple tank went down in history not as one among many desperate improvisations, but as the desperate improvisation. So what can we learn from the story of the Bob Semple tank? Is it just a funny anecdote about a ridiculous military project? Or are there deeper lessons? Lesson 1. Context is everything. Judged by German or American military engineering standards, the Bob Semple tank is a joke. But judged by the context of isolated New Zealand in 1940, with zero resources and imminent invasion, it makes desperate sense. This applies broadly. Solutions should be judged by the context in which they were created, not by abstract ideal standards. Lesson 2. Imperfect action overcomes perfect inaction. Bob Semple could have waited for real tanks from Britain or America. They eventually arrived. But in 1940, eventually could mean too late. He chose to act with imperfect resources rather than passively wait for a perfect solution that might never come. The principle is relevant in any crisis. Doing something now with limited resources often outperforms perfect planning for later. Lesson 3. Morality and psychology. Matter. The military value of Bob Semple tank was questionable, but its psychological value, demonstrating that the government was trying to protect citizens, that resistance was possible, that New Zealand was not a helpless victim, was real. In war, as in many aspects of life, perception and morality can be as important as material ability. Lesson 4. Failure is not a sin. Bob Semple tank failed in his objectives, but trying and failing is different from not trying. Bob Semple made a calculated gamble that didn't work. That doesn't make him an idiot. It makes him human, facing an impossible problem. Modern culture often punishes failure severely. Bob Semple's story reminds us that trying unconventional solutions is valid, even when they don't work. Lesson 5, improvisation, is a valuable skill. Modern military leaders recognize that perfect plans rarely survive contact with reality. The ability to improvise, to use available resources creatively, is critical. Bob Semple tank was extreme improvisation. It wasn't elegant, but it demonstrated creative thinking under pressure. Lesson 6. Small nations face impossible choices to major powers with massive industries. Bob Semple tank seems ridiculous, but small nations don't have the luxury of infinite resources. They must make difficult choices about how to allocate limited capacity. Bob Semple faced a choice: build a few suitable tanks, impossible with the resources available, or many unsuitable tanks, possible but controversial. He chose the possible option. The modern legacy, Bob Semple tank, has become part of New Zealand's cultural identity. He represents the Kiwi spirit. Practical, improvisational, determined and comfortable looking, ridiculous if necessary. New Zealand is a small nation that has historically needed to innovate to compete. From rugby teams to the film industry, Kiwis have developed a reputation for doing a lot with a little. Bob Semple tank is a spiritual ancestor of this tradition. Not because it worked, but because he exemplifies a willingness to try. There is also growing recognition of Bob Semple's larger contributions. His work on infrastructure during the war was significant. Hydroelectric projects he initiated provided power for post-war industrialization. Roads he built still exist. The tank was a failure, but the man was not. In 2019, a New Zealand brewery launched a beer called Bob Semple Tank Ale, with the slogan, "Like the tank, strong, local, and a little ridiculous." The label featured a drawing of the tank. It was a perfect embrace of legacy, acknowledging the absurd while celebrating the spirit. Behind it, the University of Auckland occasionally offers an engineering seminar called the Bob Semple Lesson. Design under extreme constraints. Students analyze designs and propose improvements while working under the same resource limitations that Bob faced. It's an educational exercise, but it also keeps history alive for new generations. In 2023, 83 years after the first Bob Semple tank rolled out of the workshop in Wellington, the legacy continues to evolve. And in ways no one could have predicted, the digital resurrection online gaming communities have turned the Bob Semple tank into a cult icon. In War Thunder, a vehicular combat game, players created petitions demanding the addition of the Bob Semple. Developers eventually added it as a special commemorative vehicle, available only on April 1st, April Fool's Day. The game's statistics are intentionally bad, but players love it precisely for that reason. Forum threads celebrate Bob Semple challenges, where players attempt to achieve victories using the worst tank in the game. In Hearts of Iron 4, a grand strategy game, modders created a special tech tree, allowing New Zealand to build Bob Semple tanks in massive quantities. It's mechanically inefficient, but hilariously fun. Memes and popular culture. The Bob Semple tank has become a recurring meme. Popular format. Girls want guys with picture of a modern tank, but guys really want picture of a Bob Semple tank. Outro, image by Bob Semple with caption, "When Mom says we have tank at home, tank at home." These memes celebrate imperfection. In an age of polished Instagram and constant self-promotion, there's something refreshing about embracing objectively flawed things with genuine affection, reconstructions and replicas. No original Bob Semple tank has survived, but enthusiasts have started building replicas. In 2018, a group of military vehicle enthusiasts in Christchurch, New Zealand, announced an ambitious project to build a working replica of the Bob Semple tank using original archival blueprints. The project took 3 years. The challenges were significant: finding a period Caterpillar D8 tractor, replicating wartime corrugated metal, and constructing decommissioned Bren machine guns for safety. In 2021, the replica was completed. The video of the first test drive went viral on YouTube, receiving millions of views. Comments were a mix of admiration and humor. "Finally, a weapon to surpass Metal Gear," one comment read. "New Zealand, where sheep are plentiful and tanks are made. Oh, from sheep sheds," another joked. Affectionately, the replica now appears in military vehicle shows and parades, generally receiving more enthusiastic applause than technically superior tanks. There is recognition that it is ridiculous, and that is precisely the point. Academic reassessment. Modern military historians are re-evaluating Bob Semple tank with a more nuanced perspective. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in New Zealand defence history, argues in a 2022 paper the Bob Semple tank should be understood not as an engineering failure, but as a success in psychological mobilization. The objective was never to fight tank battles. It was to signal resistance and raise morale during a moment of extreme national vulnerability. She points out that the New Zealand government spent relatively little on the project, perhaps 5,000 total, less than the cost of a comparable propaganda campaign. But it generated massive press coverage and public discussion about defense preparedness. In terms of cost per impact on public awareness, Mitchell writes, Bob Semple tank may have been a remarkably efficient investment. Other historians note that the project provided valuable training for engineers and welders who later worked on legitimate military projects. Workshops that built Bob Semple later repaired Allied military equipment, constructed fortifications, and supported wartime logistics. International perspective. Bob Semple tank is increasingly appearing in international discussions about small states and national security. Defense analysts point out that small modern nations face dilemmas similar to those faced by New Zealand in 1940. Limited resources, potential threats from larger neighbors, and dependence on allies who may not arrive in time. They are not suggesting that small nations build makeshift tanks, but the principle of making the best of what you have remains relevant. A 2020 article in Small Wars Journal used Bob Semple tank as a case study on strategic creativity under extreme constraints. The author argued that small nations should innovate asymmetrically rather than trying to replicate the capabilities of great powers. The human factor. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of Bob Semple's legacy is how his story resonates emotionally with ordinary people. In YouTube comments on videos about tanks, a pattern emerges. People share stories of their own Bob Semple moments, situations where they had to improvise solutions with inadequate resources. Software engineer, debugging legacy code without documentation is my Bob Semple. Tank professor, teaching online during a pandemic with bad Wi-Fi was my Bob Semple tank. Single dad, preparing dinner with random ingredients at the end of the month is my Bob Semple tank. The story transcended its military origins and became a metaphor for human resilience and creative improvisation. Bob Semple in perspective. When we evaluate Bob Semple tank 80+ years later, the verdict is complex. Militarily, failure. It did not provide adequate protection. It did not move adequately. It was not adequately armed. As a combat instrument, it was inadequate. Psychologically, partial success. It demonstrated governmental action and temporarily boosted morale, although it also generated ridicule. Economically, neutral. The cost was low enough that it did not significantly harm the war effort, but resources could have been better used elsewhere. Culturally, unexpected success. It became part of New Zealand's national identity and an international symbol of improvisational resilience, humanly understandable. Bob Semple, facing an impossible situation with impossible resources, made a reasonable choice given the information and options available in 1940. The final lesson, Bob Semple Tank, teaches us that history isn't simple. It's not about pure successes and pure failures. It's about real people doing the best they can under difficult circumstances. Bob Semple wasn't a military genius. He wasn't an idiot either. He was a pragmatist making a desperate gamble during a desperate time. His gamble didn't work out the way he expected, but it didn't cause a disaster either. And decades later, his attempt has become a symbol of something many admire, the willingness to try, even when success is unlikely. In a world that often demands perfection and punishes failure, there is something profoundly human and encouraging about Bob Semple Tank. It's a reminder that trying and failing is preferable to not trying at all, the worst. Tank in the world refused to die precisely because it represents something that never dies. The human spirit determined to fight with what it has, no matter how inadequate it may seem. Bob Semple welded a gun onto a tractor and called it a tank. The world laughed, but he tried, and that attempt, however imperfect, deserves to be remembered, not as an example of military brilliance, but as a testament to human courage and determination in the face of impossibility. The farmer-turned-politician who became a minister may not have built a great tank, but he built something more lasting, a story that continues to inspire people 80 years later, and perhaps, in the end, that will be a victory for themselves. End.